Together, Call and Augustus cut Long Bill down, pulled the noose from his neck, and then, feeling weak, left him to the womenfolk. One of the laundresses covered him with a sheet that had spilled out when her basket overturned. Maggie came down the steps and went to Pearl, but Pearl was beyond comforting. She sobbed deep, guttural sobs as hoarse as a cow's bellow. Maggie got her to sit down on an overturned milk bucket. The two laundresses helped Maggie as best they could. "I don't want him going to heaven with his face so black," Pearl said suddenly. "They'll take him for a nigger." Maggie didn't answer. The undertaker had been killed in the raid. Funerals since then had been hasty and plain. Call and Gus caught their horses and rode on to the governor's. Though the distance was not great, both felt too weak to walk that far. "What are we going to say to the governor now that this has happened?" Augustus asked. "He's the governor. I guess he can do the talking," Call said as they rode up the street. When informed of the tragedy, Governor Pease shook his head and stared out the window for several minutes. A military man was with him when the two captains came in, a Major Nettleson of the U.S. Cavalry. "That's 3 suicides since the raid," Governor Pease said. "Raids on that scale have a very poor effect on the nerves of the populace. Happens even in the Army, don't it, Major?" "Why, yes, we sometimes have a suicide or two after a violent scrap," the Major said. He looked at the Rangers impatiently, either because they were late or because they were interrupting his own interview with the governor. "Bill Coleman had been with us through it all, Governor," Call said. "We never expected to lose him that way." Governor Pease turned from the window and sighed. Call noticed that the governor's old brown coat was stained. Since the raid, he had often been seen in an untidy state. He had grown careless with his tobacco juice, too. Judging from the carpet, he missed his spittoon about as often as he hit it. "It's one more murder we can charge to Buffalo Hump," the governor said. "People can only tolerate so much scalping and raping. They get nervous and start losing sleep. A lack of sound sleep soon breaks them down. The next thing you know, they start killing themselves rather than worry about when the Comanches will show up again." Just then Inez Skull came striding into the room. Major Nettleson, who had been sitting, hefted himself up. He was a beefy man. Madame Skull merely glanced at him, but her glance caused the Major to flush. Augustus, who was merely waiting dully for the interview to be over, noted the flush. "Why, there you are, Johnny Nettleson," Inez said. "Why'd you leave so early? I rather prefer for my house guests to stay around for breakfast, though I suppose that's asking too much of a military man." "It's my fault, Inez," the governor said quickly. "I wanted a word with the Major. Since he's leaving, I thought we'd best meet early." "No, Johnny ain't leaving, not today," Madame Skull said. "I've planned a picnic, and I won't allow anything to spoil it. It's rare that I get a major to picnic with." Then she looked at Governor Pease defiantly. The governor, surprised, stared back at her, while Major Nettleson, far too embarrassed to speak, stared solemnly at his own 2 feet. Augustus suspected that it was stout Major Nettleson that Madame Skull was trotting with now. The picnic she was anxious not to have spoiled might not be of the conventional kind. But this suspicion only registered with him dully. His mind was on the night before, most of which, as usual, he had spent drinking with Long Bill Coleman. It was a close night, and the saloon an immoderately smelly place. During the raid, a bartender had been stabbed and scalped in a rear corner of the barroom. The bartender had been murdered, and so had the janitor, which meant that the bloody corner had been only perfunctorily cleaned. On close nights, the smells made pleasant drinking difficult, so difficult that Gus had left a little early, feeling that he needed a breath of river air. "Come along, Billy, it's late," he said to Long Bill. "Nope, I prefer to drink indoors, Gus," Long Bill replied. "I'm less tempted to seek horrors when I drink inside." Augustus took the comment for a joke and went on out into the clean air to nestle comfortably by the riverbank all night. But now the remark about whores, the last words he would ever hear from Long Bill Coleman, came back to mind. Had Bill, so deeply attached to Pearl, really been seeking whores? Or was it, as he had supposed, a joke? He didn't know. But he did know that he hated being in the governor's office listening to Inez Skull banter with her new conquest, Major Nettleson. Long Bill's death was as much a shock as Clara's marriage. It left him indifferent to everything. Why was he there? What did he care about rangering now? He'd never stroll the streets of Austin again, either with the woman or the friend. At the thought, such a hopeless sadness took him that he turned and walked out the door, passing directly in front of the governor, the major, and Madame Skull as he went. "I'll say now, where's McCrae going?" the governor said in surprise. "The two of you have just got here. I haven't even had a moment to bring up the business at hand." "I expect he's sad about our part. He'd ridden with the man for many years," Call said. "Well, but he was your friend too, and you ain't walked out," Governor Pease said. "No," Call said, though he wished the governor would get down to business. He thought he knew how Gus felt when he walked out. The governor seemed momentarily thrown off by Gus's departure. He bent right over the spittoon, but still managed to miss it with a stream of tobacco juice. Madame Skull had relaxed, but Major Nettleson hadn't. "Was there something in particular, Governor?" Call asked finally. "Long Bill will be needing a funeral and a burial soon. I'd like to arrange it nice, since he was our friend." "Of course. Excuse me," Governor Pease said, coming back to himself. "Arrange it nice, and arrange it soon. There's work waiting for you and McCrae and whatever troop you can round up." "What's the work?" Call asked. "Ahumado has Captain Skull," the governor said. "He's offered to exchange him for 1,000 cattle delivered in Mexico. I've consulted the legislature, and they think we better comply, though we know it's a gamble." "The U.S. Army cannot be involved. Not involved," Major Nettleson said suddenly and loudly. "I've made that plain to Governor Pease, and I'll make it plain to you. I'm trying to train 3 regiments of cavalry to move against the Comanche and finish them. I've no men to spare for Mexico, and even if I did have men, I wouldn't send them below the border, now that there is a border, more or less. Not a man of mine will set foot across the Rio Grande, not a man. I must firmly decline to be involved, though, of course, I'd be happy to see Captain Skull again if he's alive." Both the governor and Call were nonplussed by this stream of talk. Madame Skull, however, was merely amused. "Oh, shut up, Johnny, and stop telling lies," she said with a flirtatious toss of her head. "What lies? I'm merely pointing out that the U.S. Army can't put itself out every time a bandit demands a ransom." "No, the lie was that you'd be happy to see Inish again," Madame Skull said. "You weren't happy to see him when he was your commanding officer, I seem to recall." "Not happy? I fail to understand." "Really, Madame," Major Nettleson protested, turning cherry red from embarrassment. "Inish always thought you were a fat-gutted fool," Mrs. Skull said. "He said as much many times. The only man in the whole army Inish thought had any sense was Bob Lee, and Bob Lee's a little too stiff-necked for my taste." Then she looked at Governor Pease, who was staring at her as if she was insane. "Close your mouth, Ed, before a bug flies down your gullet," she said. "I'm taking Johnny off to our picnic now. I've managed to find virtues in him that Inish never suspected." As Madame Skull was about to leave, she paused a moment and looked at Call. 1,000 cattle is a good deal more than Inish is worth," she said. "I wouldn't give 3 cats for him myself, unless the cats were mangy. If you see that yellow gal of mine while you're looking for Inish, bring her back, too. I have yet to find a match for that yellow gal. She had the Cuba touch." "I doubt we'll spot her, ma'am," Call said. "The Comanches went north, and we're going south." "And you think life is that simple, do you, Captain?" Inez Skull said, with more than a little mockery in her tone. "You think it's just a matter of plain north or south, do you?" Call was perplexed. He could not clear his mind of the image of Long Bill Coleman hanging dead by his own hand from a live oak limb. More than 10 years of his life had been bound up with Long Bill Coleman. Now he was dead. He found it hard to attend to the mocking woman in front of him. His mind wanted to drift backward down the long river of the past to the beginning of his rangering days. He wished Madame Skull would just go away and not be teasing him with questions. "I hope you'll come to tea with me before you leave, Captain," Madame Skull said. "I might be able to teach you that there's more to life than north and south." With that, she turned on her heels and left. "Can't interfere with Mexico, not the U.S. cavalry," Major Nettleson said. Then he left, putting on his military hat as he went through the door. Governor Pease spat once more, inaccurately, at the brass spittoon. "If I had a wife like that, I'd run farther than Mexico," the governor said quietly. His own wife had only raised her voice to him once in 20 years of marriage, and that was because the baby was about to knock the soup pot off the table. Call didn't know what to say. He thought he'd best stick to simple, practical considerations and not let himself be sidetracked by what Madame Skull felt or didn't feel about her husband. "You mentioned 1,000 head of cattle, Governor," Call said. "Yes, that's the demand," Governor Pease said in a slow, weary voice. 1,000 head. We have a month to make the delivery." "What if the captain's already dead?" Call asked. "Why, that's the gamble," the governor said. "The man might take our cattle and send us Einish's head in a sack." "Or he might just take the cattle and vanish," Call said. "Yes, he might. But I have to send you," the governor said. "At least, I have to ask you if you'll go. I'm not forgetting that I just sent you off on a wild goose chase just when we needed you here the most. But Ahumado has Einish, and he's set a price on him. Einish is still a hero. They'll impeach me if I don't try to get him back." "Where will we get the cattle?" Call asked. "Why, the legislature will vote the money for the cattle, I'm sure," the governor said. Call started to ask a practical question, only to have his mind stall. He saw Long Bill's black face again and couldn't seem to think beyond it. The governor talked, and the governor talked, but Call was simply unable to take in what he was saying, a fact Governor Pease finally noticed. "Wrong time. You've got your friend to bury," he said. "We can talk of these arrangements tomorrow when your sad duty has been done." "Thanks," Call said. He turned and was about to leave, but Governor Pease caught his arm. "Just one more thing, Captain Call," he said. "Inez mentioned having you to tea. Don't go. The state of Texas needs you more than she does in this troubled hour." "Yes, sir, I expect it does," Call said. When Call got back to the ranger corrals, he heard the sound of hammering from behind the barn. Ike Ripple, the oldest ranger left alive, was making Long Bill a coffin, or at least he was supervising. Ike had never advanced much in the ranks of the Rangers due to his taste for supervising as opposed to actually working. He and Long Bill had been sincere friends, though, which is why he stood beside Dietz to supervise the sawing of every plank and the driving of every nail. "Billy was particular, and he'd want to be laid out proper," Ike said when Call joined the group, which consisted of the entire Ranger troop, such as it then was. Augustus sat on one end of the wagon that was to haul Long Bill to his grave. He was silent, somber, and drunk. Dietz put the coffin together meticulously, well aware that he was being watched by the whole troop. Lee Hitch and Stove Jones had spent a night of insobriety in a Mexican cantina. They were so hungover as to be incapable of carpentry. Stove Jones was bald and Lee Hitch shaggy. They spent their evenings in the cantina because they had ceased to be able to secure adequate credit in the saloons of Austin. Call noticed that neither man was wearing a sidearm. "Where's your guns?" he asked them. Lee Hitch looked at his hip and saw no pistol, which seemed to surprise him as much as if his whole leg were missing. "Well, where is it, damn it?" he asked himself. "I don't require you to swear," Call said. "We've a mission to go on soon, and you'll need your weapons. Where's yours, Stove?" Stove Jones took refuge in deep, silent solemnity when asked questions he didn't want to answer. He stared back at Call solemnly, but Call was not to be bluffed by such tactics, forcing Stove to rack his brain for a suitable answer. "I expect it's under my saddle," he said finally. "They pawn their guns, Woodrow," Augustus said. "I say just let them fight the Comanches with their pocket knives. A man who would sink so low as to pawn his own pistol deserves a good scalping anyway." "It's not the Comanches," Call told him. "It's Ahumado. He's got Captain Skull, and he's offered to ransom him for 1,000 cattle." "That lets me out. I ain't got 1,000 cattle," Gus said. "The state will buy the cattle. We have to deliver them and bring back the captain," Call told him. "Well, that still lets me out because I ain't a cowboy," Gus said. "I have no interest in gathering cattle for some old bandit. Let him just come and steal them. He can leave off the captain if he wants to." Call noted that the coffin was almost finished. He saw no reason to pursue an argument with Gus at such a time. In his present mood, Gus would easily find a reason to disagree with anything he might say. The men were all stunned by Long Bill's suicide. The best procedure would probably be to go on and hold the funeral if the women were up to it. With no undertaker and no preacher, funerals were rude affairs, but they were still funerals. The women folk could sing, and the ceremony would draw the men away from the saloons for a few minutes. Once their old compañero was laid to rest, there would be time to consider the matter of Ahumado and the 1,000 cattle. "We don't have to worry about the mission right this minute," Call said. "We've got a month to deliver the cattle. Let's go see how the womenfolk are doing while Dietz finishes the coffin." "Nearly done," Dietz said, wondering if he was expected to go to the funeral, or if he would even be allowed to. He worked carefully on the coffin. One of the laundresses had brought over an old quilt to line it with. Dietz took special care to see that the lining was laid in smoothly. He knew that the spirits of suicides were restless. They were more likely than other people to float out of their graves and become spooks, harassing those who had offended them in life. He was not aware that he had offended Long Bill. He had helped him with quite a few chores, but all that might be forgotten if he then built him an uncomfortable coffin, a coffin his spirit could not be at rest in. Mr. Bill, as Dietz had always called him, had rangered far in his life. It would be too bad if his spirit had to keep rangering for want of a comfortable resting place. "We ought to caulk this coffin, I expect," Ikey Ripple said, rendering his first judgment on the matter. The coffin was sitting on 2 sawhorses. He bent over and peered underneath it, an action that aggravated his rheumatism. It was a coffin that could profit from a good caulking, in his view. "I doubt we have anything to caulk it with," Call said. "It won't hold out the worms or the maggots no time if we don't give it a caulking," Ikey insisted. "Well, the store's closed. I don't know where we could get any caulking," Call said. With the Forsythe store still out of operation, everyone in town was constantly discovering that they needed some small necessity which there was no way to procure. "Billy Coleman was a fine fella," Ikey went on. "He deserves better than to be bloated up with screwworms before he's hardly in his grave. The darn state of Texas ought to have some caulking somewhere." Mention of screwworms at a moment of such solemnity made everyone queasy, even Call, for they had all seen the dreadful putrefaction that resulted when screwworms infested a deer or a cow. The thought that such might happen to Long Bill Coleman, a comrade who had been walking among them only yesterday, made everyone unhappy. "Shut up talking about worms and maggots, Ikey," Augustus said. "Long Bill's just as apt to be up in heaven playing a harp as he is to be having screwworms infect him." Ikey Ripple considered the remark obtuse, and besides that it was made in an unfriendly tone, a tone particularly unwelcome for having come from a raw youth such as Gus McCrae. Ikey had passed his 70th year and considered anyone under 50 to be callow at best. "I don't know what happens in heaven, but I do know what happens when you stick a coffin in the ground that ain't caulked," Ikey said. "Worms and maggots, that's what." Dietz had just finished the coffin lid, which fitted snugly. "Ikey, stop your griping," Gus said. "Plenty of our fine rangers have been buried without no coffin at all." "Them boards are thin. I expect the worms will get in pretty soon, even if you do caulk it," Stove Jones observed. "Worms and varmints. A hungry varmint'll dig up a coffin unless it's buried deep," Lee Hitch added. "You are all too goddamn gloomy," Augustus said. "I say let's bury Billy Coleman and go get soundly drunk in his memory." He got off the wagon and began to walk toward the Coleman house. "I expect we'll just have to do without the caulking," Call said. "Just load the coffin in the wagon and bring it to the house. I believe it would be best to get this burying done." Then he followed Gus, who was walking slowly. Ahead, a knot of women stood around the back porch of the Coleman house. Call looked for Maggie, but didn't see her at first. When he did spot her, she was not with the women on the porch. They were respectable women, of course. Maggie sat alone on the steps going up to her rooms. She had her face in her hands, and her shoulders were shaking. "Mag's upset," Gus said. "I expect one of these old church biddies ran her off from the morning." "I expect," Call said. "Maggie's close to Pearl. She took the arrows out of her after the raid," she said. "The doctor was busy with the serious wounds." When Call walked over and asked Maggie if one of the ladies had been rude to her, Maggie shook her head. She looked up at him, her face wet with tears. "It's just so hard, Woodrow," she said. "It's just so hard." "Well, but there's easy times, too," Call said awkwardly. He immediately felt he had said something wrong. He could never come up with the right words when Maggie cried. His remark was true enough. There were easy times, but the day of Long Bill's death was not one of them. "Not for me," Maggie wanted to say when he mentioned easy times. She wanted to go be with Pearl Coleman, but she couldn't because of her position. It was hard, not easy, but there was no point in trying to make Woodrow understand how hard it was for her. "It's sunny, at least," Call said. "Bill hung himself on a mighty pretty day." That didn't sound right either, although it was true the day was brilliant. To his dismay, Maggie began to cry all the harder. He didn't know whether it was the standoffish women, or Long Bill's death, or his ill-chosen remarks. He had thought to comfort her, but he didn't know how. He stood awkwardly by the steps, feeling that he would have been wiser just to go along with Gus and see that Bill was wrapped up proper and ready for the coffin. "Hush, Woodrow, you don't have to talk," Maggie said, grateful that he had come to stand beside her. It was the first time he had done such a thing when there were people watching. Just then the Rangers came around the corner with the coffin in the wagon. Old Ikey Ripple, who had once pestered Maggie endlessly, drove the wagon. The other Rangers rode behind the wagon. All of them saw Call standing by Maggie at the bottom of the steps. "I best go. Will you be coming?" Call asked. "Yes, I'll follow along," Maggie said, surprised that he asked. There was green spring grass in the little graveyard when they buried Long Bill Coleman. Trees were leafing out green on the distant slopes. Fine, clear sunlight shone on the mourners. Mockingbirds sang on after the hymn-singing stopped, and the mound of red dirt was shoveled back in the grave. Maggie, fearing censure, hadn't followed very close. Pearl Coleman, bereft, heaved her deep cow sobs throughout the brief service. "I'm a poor talker, you talk over him," Call whispered to Augustus when the time had come for someone to speak a few words over the departed. Augustus McCrae stood so long in thought that Call was afraid he wouldn't find it in him to speak. But Gus, hat in hand, finally looked up at the little crowd. "It's too pretty a day to be dying. But Long Bill's dead, and that's that," he said. "I recall that he liked that scripture about the green pastures. It's spring weather, and there'll be green grass growing over him soon." He paused a minute, fumbling with his hat. When he spoke again, he had some trouble controlling his voice. "Billy, he was a fine pard. Let's go home," he said finally. Pearl Coleman had a brother, Joel, who was stout like her. Joel helped his sobbing sister back down the path toward town. The ladies who liked Pearl and had come to support her in her hour of grief followed the brother and sister away. The other townspeople trickled away in twos and threes, but the Rangers were reluctant to leave. In the heat of battle, they had surrendered many comrades to death, often having no opportunity to bury them or take note of their passing at all. But this death had not occurred in battle. It occurred because Long Bill, a man who had been stout-hearted through much violent strife, wanted it. "I wish we'd had time to caulk the coffin," Ikey Ripple said. "I expect it'll be worms and maggots for Billy pretty soon." The others cast hard glances at him, causing Ikey to conclude that his views were not appreciated. He decided to seek a saloon, and was joined in his search by Lee Hitch and Stove Jones, men disposed to overlook his views of worms and maggots. "Reckon Bill would change his mind if he had a chance to?" Gus asked Call. They were the last to leave, although P.I. was not far from them on the path. Call had been asking himself the same question all day. The last conversation he had had with Long Bill Coleman had been a casual one about the relative merits of mares and geldings as saddle horses. Long Bill argued for geldings as being more stable. Call argued for mares for their alertness. Long Bill talked fondly of a horse he had favored in earlier years, a sorrel gelding named Sugar who had carried him safely on many patrols. Call reminded Bill of a time when Sugar had shied at a badger and run away with him. They had a chuckle, remembering the runaway. It had been an easy conversation about horses, of the sort he had often had with Long Bill over the years. Sugar grew old and had to be put out to pasture, but Long Bill from time to time would have another gelding whose virtues he would brag about, just as Call from time to time would acquire an exceptional mare. They would often talk about horses, he and Bill. Whatever troubles might be elsewhere in their lives never dampened their interest in the pleasure to be had with good horses. "He can't change his mind, Gus," It's foolish to even think that way, Call said. Gone is gone. I know it, Gus said. Yet he could not stop wondering about Long Bill. In the saloon the night before, Long Bill had seemed somber, but not more somber than he had been on many a night. Augustus couldn't get the business of hanging out of his mind. Hanging wasn't simple, like shooting oneself. Shooting he could imagine. A momentary hopelessness, such as he himself had felt several times since Clara's marriage, could cause a man to grab a pistol and send a bullet into his brain. A few seconds, rushing by so fast they gave one no time for second thoughts, would allow a man to end the matter. But hanging was different. A rope had to be found and a stool to climb on. Long Bill had watched the hanging of quite a few thieves and miscreants in his years arrangering. He knew the result was often imperfect if the knot was set wrong. The hanged man might dangle and kick for several minutes before his air supply was finally cut off. Care had to be taken when a hanging was contemplated. A good limb had to be chosen, for one thing. Limbs that looked stout to the eye would often sag so far in practice that the hanged man's feet would touch the ground. Long Bill had never been skilled with his hands, thus his quick failure as a carpenter. It taxed him to tie a simple halter knot. The more Gus thought about the physical complications involved in hanging, the more perplexed he felt that his friend had been able to manage his final action successfully. And why? Had there been a sharp quarrel? Had a nightmare afflicted him so powerfully that he lost his bearings? It seemed that Long Bill was so determined to be free of earthly sorrow that he had gone about the preparations for his death with more competence than he had been capable of when only the chores of life were involved. He had even done it all in the dark, perhaps fearing that if he saw the bright sunrise, he might weaken in his resolve and not do it. I just wonder what Bill was thinking there at the end, Gus said. You can wonder all you want to, Call said. We'll never know that. It's just as well not to think about it. I can't help thinking about it, Woodrow, can you? Gus asked. I was the last man to drink with him. I expect I'll think about it for years. They had walked back almost to the steps that led to Maggie's rooms. I think about it, Call admitted. But I ought to stop. He's dead. We buried him. Call felt, though, that the comment had been inadequate. After all, he too had been friends with Long Bill for many years. He had known several men who had lost limbs in battle. The men all claimed that they still felt things in the place where the limb had been. It was natural enough, then, that with Bill suddenly gone, he and Gus would continue to have some of the feelings that went with friendship, even though the friend was gone. I can't be thinking about him so much that I can't get the chores done, that's what I meant, Call added. Augustus looked at him curiously, a look that was sort of a slant. Well, that's you, Woodrow. You'll always get the chores done, Augustus said. I ain't that much of a worker myself. I can skip a chore now and then if it's a sunny day. I don't know what sunny has to do with chores. They need to be done whether it's sunny or not, Call said. Augustus was silent. He was still thinking about Long Bill, wondering what despair had infested his mind while he was looking for the rope and setting the milking stool in place. It's funny, he said. What is? Call asked. Billy was the worst roper in the outfit, Augustus said. If you put him in the lots with a tame goat, the goat would die of old age before Billy could manage to get a loop on it, remember? Why, yes, that's true, Call said. He never was much of a roper. It might take him 6 or 7 tries just to catch his own horse, Augustus said. If we was in a hurry, I'd usually catch his horse for him just to save time. Call started to go up the stairs to see Maggie, but paused a moment. You're right, he said. The only thing the man ever roped on the first try was himself. That's a curiosity, ain't it? Why, yes, Augustus said. That's a curiosity. Call still had his hat in his hand. He put it on and went up the steps to Maggie. Woodrow's lucky and he don't know it, Augustus thought. He's got a girl to go to. I wish I had a girl to go to. Whore or no whore, I wouldn't care.